Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to Tabletops and Taverns, where I go ahead and talk about a topic relevant to tabletop gaming. In this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about inspiration for role-playing games. Not the 5th edition mechanic, but rather inspiration on designing role-playing scenarios and stories as well as characters within them. Now, I personally use a lot of derivative storylines, derivative scenarios, derivative characters that I've seen in literature and other media, as have many others, and indeed this goes on from prior to role-playing games. Literature used characters that were derived from earlier literature and myths and so on and so forth, so it's actually part of a grand tradition. I am always a big proponent of the focus on the fun of a game rather than on being completely original all the time. And if you've seen some of my other videos, you will note that although I do try to make, I do mention focusing on fun over originality a lot. And that doesn't mean just rip off word for word or rip characters directly from other media. What that means is that you use the scenarios, situations, and characters that you see in other media, be it literature, be it film, be it music, and then you make it your own, and you make it fit within the world that you're currently portraying. And to me, as long as everybody at your, you know what your group wants, and I think that as long as they're having fun, the people that you're running the game for, as long as they're having fun, then whatever you just put at them is completely original or not is irrelevant. What matters is that you're all enjoying yourselves. Now, there are some actual benefits from taking scenarios, from taking characters and so forth from other media. And that is that it develops a kind of common imagery. And I've touched on this in other videos. Using themes from literature, using, characters, not necessarily point for point, but basing characters on other characters. You're using scenarios that you might see in other movies or in books, does have a benefit in that it creates common imagery. If your group is familiar with the source product or whatever, and let's say you're running a space battle or something similar, and you use descriptive imagery that calls back to, say, a Star Wars space battle or whatever, that helps in an instant, or very close to an instant, helps put this image in your player's mind so they are very sure what's going on, and they all have a common idea as to what's going on at that moment. So there is that. That is a benefit of using inspiration from other media. Whether, even if you've changed it a great deal, there is the source to reference so that you can very quickly build up imagery in your players' minds. The second is that a lot of tropes, a lot of storylines, a lot of things that you'd see in other media, since they have been taken from prior media before that, you can reference a storyline from a film, which is actually taken from a book, which is actually inspired by another book from many years ago, which is actually inspired from a myth. And because there are these common threads that run throughout, the details may vary, but the overall arc, the overall story arc, is tested. It's time tested. So you know that it has resonated with audiences before. So there is a benefit from that rather than going completely out on a limb. You can change it up, you can add your own twists, but if the overall arc is something that you've seen in other media, then you can be pretty sure that it'll sustain some of that same weight because it's been tried and it's been tested and tried before. So there's two benefits that I take from taking other media as inspiration for things that I put in the game. I'll cover more on fitting it into your own personal style, making the difference between an inspiration and a rip-off. I'll talk about more about that at the end. But for now, let's talk about the various places you can find inspiration for your games, because I know a lot of people wonder, hey, is it okay to use this as inspiration? I have seen questions on gaming forums where people genuinely ask, is it all right to build an adventure or to build a campaign using this historical period as a base? And so we'll touch on history as a source of inspiration right off the bat. So to answer that question, yes it is. In fact, a lot of people in other media use historical aspects as a base to draw elements into their own campaigns all the time. In fact, RPGs kind of rose out of wargaming, and wargaming enthusiasts tended to be people who were history buffs. And indeed, for most of the first years of RPGs, a lot of people who were really into RPGs tended to be history buffs. And this still reflects somewhat today, although since RPGs moved more into the mainstream, and don't tell me they aren't, because now even general hobby industry standards are recognizing RPGs as a mainstream product. Since it's moved more into the mainstream, that assumption that the majority of people at your table are going to be history buffs no longer holds. And so you actually, as a adventure designer or as the DM who's going to be designing the scenarios, that's actually of benefit to you, especially if you take inspiration from history. Because number one, there's been a lot of really, really interesting things that have happened throughout history, some of them very much stranger than fiction. And number two, if your players aren't familiar with the historical period that you're referencing, then they'll think that these complex plots, these interesting war scenarios, these interesting royal plots or whatever that you're drawing on from history, they'll think that you're that you're something special when you come up with this stuff, even if you rip it pretty much directly off of history. You've got, as I've mentioned, you've got wars throughout history that you can draw from. You've got the tales of exploits of certain individuals that you can draw on from history. You've got mythological heroes that you can draw on from history, like Beowulf and such. You can draw on various periods for inspiration. If your game is set in the medieval period, you can draw on historical European medieval situations, or even non-European situations like feudal Japan or whatever. I've done games based on, not in feudal Japan, but on a society very much similar to it, and I drew on inspirations from that history just to fill in the blanks that I really didn't feel like coming up with. And it's a way to get complexity in your game without having to come up with a whole bunch of stuff just from scratch. Now, some people will recognize what you're doing. Like if you do a big setup that's very similar to, say, the War of the Roses, then people will notice that are familiar with that historical time period, and they may use it to their advantage in your game. But to be honest, if they're going to do that, more power to them anyway, because at least they're familiar with the material. This is, as I said, evident in other media. For instance, J.R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire draws a lot from certain medieval and late medieval wars. There's all sorts of things that you can actually draw from history, and before touching any other media. And I encourage you, especially if you're setting your game in a setting that's heavily inspired by a particular period, for instance, a Viking era game, I do encourage you to look at actual history from the time and think about some of the plots, some of the some of the politics involved at the time and so forth. And I do encourage you to draw inspiration from that. The second biggie that people draw inspiration from is literature. Now, as I've touched on before, the classics, of course, are things like The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and so forth. But a lot of the things in Appendix N, and this was recognized as far back as the AD&D and the origins of the game, the reliance on sword and sorcery and fantasy literature, especially for D&D, as a source for inspiration was recognized even back then. In fact, some of the things that are on Appendix N I find to read almost exactly like D&D games, except they were written way before D&D was even remotely a concept. For instance, if you've read any of the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stuff, the Lankmar stuff, that reads like somebody was playing D&D at a table and actually wrote down some of the things that their characters did. Robert Howard's Conan series, of course, that's the classic, but also his Solomon Kane series. If you're looking for something darker, there's some Clark Ashton Smith stuff that was written that was really almost like H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, but it was in a dark fantasy realm. So I often refer to things like that just for inspiration, if not for storylines, then for descriptives and for the kinds of places my characters might, or my group might encounter. And I have no problem taking elements of that and putting them into the game. If you're playing, if there's a lot of modern series that can provide inspiration for fantasy. The Witcher series, of course, the Song of Ice and Fire series, and so on and so forth. If you're playing a game that's not fantasy, you can go directly to that particular genre of literature. I'm not even going to mention the H.P. Lovecraft stuff for Call of Cthulhu, because, quite frankly, Call of Cthulhu is so rooted in the Lovecraft mythos that, of course, you're going to need those books for inspiration. But something like Shadowrun, for instance. Shadowrun draws a lot of stuff from cyberpunk-type books. So if you're running some Shadowrun, you might want to look into Gibson and the like. Interestingly enough, William Gibson does not like Shadowrun, but it doesn't matter if the author doesn't like the derivative, something derivative of his work eventually, because you can still use the original source, the original author's work, for your inspiration. What I've noticed, and this is an interesting little factoid about sci-fi stuff, and this isn't absolute, but in general, I've noticed that sci-fi games tend to run closer to their inspiration than fantasy. And I'm saying that in that because science fiction can be so divided in terms of the universe that it portrays, a lot of sci-fi will tend to take a lot of inspiration from the science fiction works that are very similar to it. Of course, there's the obvious. If you've got a Star Wars RPG, it's of course going to take inspiration from Star Wars books. But there's other instances where the material follows more closely to a particular universe in sci-fi than fantasy does to a particular time period. Because there's a lot of fantasy tropes that you can throw them in, not just in any D&D game, but like in any fantasy RPG in general, and they'll work. Whereas in sci-fi, because they rely on certain limitations that may or may not exist in a certain example of science fiction, then you're going to have some games that clump closer to others. For instance, if you take a look at Shatter Zone or whatever, that has a lot more to do with the sort of flying space, the space epic type sci-fi that requires a lot of distant star travel and such, than something a little bit closer to the current time period would, for instance. Cyberpunk stuff doesn't necessarily involve a lot of space travel, so it's going to focus more on near future type stuff. So if you're doing a lot of sci-fi and you're trying to get inspiration on that, you're going to want to stick to books and eventually movies that are closer to the genre. And I'm getting really distracted here, I'm sorry, because we need to move on to movies. Similar to literature, movies are a very good source of inspiration for games, and I want to almost say less so for the storylines, because a lot of really good movie storylines are actually taken from literature, but more for the imagery. If you're going to take anything from a movie, I've noticed it's the imagery and the cinematic experience that movies really do contribute in terms of inspiration. For instance, if you're borrowing, and again I'm going to say it from Song of Ice and Fire, if you're borrowing from that, then you're probably going to take, you can take the storyline, similar storyline, either from the series, from the original books, or from the original historical material that some of it was based on. But in terms of the imagery, you're probably going to rely on the or on the series, because it's a very visual, it's a visual medium. Likewise, if you're relying on, say, something epic like The Lord of the Rings has a long series, has a long history of being an inspiration for RPGs since way before the movies, since the earliest days. But in terms of referencing the imagery of these grand sweeping armies, you're probably going to be referencing something from the movie, because it's very visual and people know about it and people can see it, and it's all right to do that. In fact, you can take a lot of, not necessarily the clips from the movie, but you can take a lot of the descriptives that you would use to describe these sweeping scenes and use them in describing other things in a game, and it will really kind of lend a sort of weight to your descriptions and your imagery in the game. For instance, if you're talking about a trap in the game that has some sort of rolling boulder or something, you can take the visceral imagery of, say, that scene in Indiana Jones, and you can actually, before the game, you can look at all the details and such and then write them down, and remember to reference them in the game, so that it can lend a weight, an imagery weight to your descriptions, so that everybody at the table, or at least anybody at the table who's seen that particular scene, it'll spring to mind. It'll evoke an image directly without having to rely too much on the build-up. And it's something to remember. Because now you can only really rely on this if your players, if the people at your table have that common experience. If you're going to reference something that is, say, less common, then you're probably going to be taking inspiration of that for your own purposes, and that's going to be a different animal than taking inspiration from something in order to then benefit from the shared imagery that you're going to be evoking. The last major source of inspiration for RPGs I want to talk about is music. Now, I've talked about using music as an atmospheric mood setter in games before, and that can be done. But what I've noticed is that, especially when I'm writing new adventures, I will often listen to certain genres in order to get me in the mindset to write, to come up with ideas, to describe certain areas. And the music itself may not have anything to do with the particular genre, but it does put me in that mindset so that the ideas just flow more freely. So I do encourage listening to music while you're writing you're doing your initial adventure design. Some people prefer certain bands or genres for different types of adventure writing. For me, for instance, I prefer listening to actually game soundtracks, such as Baldur's Gate, the Witcher series, or Dragon Quest series, when I'm designing like generic fantasy or heroic fantasy type stuff. Like especially the Dragon Quest series is very evocative of an heroic kind of upbeat sort of world. So if I'm focused on writing a fantasy adventure that I'm expecting the heroes to go in and actually be heroes and win the day and save the day, that's actually very inspiring in terms of coming up with putting on the background for ideas and such. When I'm trying to evoke something that's more of an old school feel, like an adventure that you'd see in the 80s or something, I'll listen to various metal bands, especially metal bands from the 80s, but also things of a similar bent. If I'm writing something that's Vikings inspired, for instance, I'll toss on some Tyr or something like that. But I find that certain bands, certain genres will actually kind of get the mind working towards things that fit certain adventure types. And if you've got an adventure type in mind while you're writing, then that can be incredibly beneficial. Now, as I said, the other use for music is to provide some sort of mood in the game, but that's not really inspiring you. That's more inspiring the players. And in that case, I'd probably recommend more atmospheric music so that it doesn't drown out your descriptions, which are more important than the actual music that you play in the background. So you've got these things that you've got these various sources that you can draw your inspiration from. You got literature, you've got history, you've got music, you've got movies. But the important part is making it your own. And what that means is don't rip off, unless you're writing, and I always have to put this caveat in there, and it's going to totally destroy what I'm going to say later, but unless you're writing something that is directly derived from that, for instance, if you're writing an adventure for Call of Cthulhu, then of course you're going to directly reference the Cthulhu mythos. If you're writing an adventure for Star Wars RPG, for instance, then yeah, of course you're going to directly reference the Star Wars universe. But more generally, if you're just writing for a general fantasy game or your own particular homebrew setting or whatever, you're going to want to make the source of inspiration your own. And that can be done in a number of ways. The simplest way is simply to craft a character that shares, for instance, if you're focused on the character, craft a character that shares similarities with an existing character, but change the name, change the description so that they're more in the feel of your own world. Change their background up, give them another background. You can use that character as a basis for the mannerisms and even for some of the abilities, but give them their own unique flair. Make it so that the characters don't immediately, upon seeing that character, instantly place that character's inspiration, because you'll get a lot more mileage that way. And one technique is to actually take two characters and kind of combine their traits. And what that will do is it'll make for a little bit of a more complex character, but it'll also make it harder for the players to identify exactly which one you're trying to duplicate. And half of them will think, oh, this one looks like this character, and then the other half will think, oh, it looks like this other character. And as long as there's that doubt there, they're not going to be able to accuse you of just ripping something off. It takes a little bit more work, but actually, honestly, not as much as you'd think. It's an interesting thing to go ahead and run. There's also the idea of adapting existing properties to your own setting in a more general way. That is, instead of just directly ripping off a scenario or whatever, what you want to do is just look for the salient points, the things that really stand out. And then what you can do out of that is, for instance, if you've got a storyline and you like the storyline of this one movie, instead of duplicating it shot for shot effectively in your own game, what you want to do is just think about it. Think about something that you've seen before, a plot or whatever, and then jot down the main points in a very general manner, and then write your own story to incorporate those plot points. And what you end up with is a unique and actually pretty original derivation of a plot that's close enough to the original that it'll lend some weight to your descriptions and your actions in your player's mind. That's another technique I use from time to time. I've also actually, and I'm ashamed to say this, I've actually just taken characters and items from other genres. In other words, I've taken like sci-fi characters from sci-fi movies or science fantasy movies, and I've dropped them into D&D and then just switched them around, switched them to D&D statistics, and that's usually enough to disguise the character in question. Not all the time, but usually enough to disguise it in a reasonable tone. Like I've got a goblin bounty hunter that is D&D created. He's a wandering bounty hunter that uses a lot of gadgets, and he's actually based off of Cad Bane from the Star Wars series. And it's funny because I'd actually been playing him in a place for several sessions before somebody realized whom he was based off of. And the only reason they realized whom he was based off of was because they knew that I was a fan of that particular character, and they saw him use some levitation boots and use levitation boots to gain some height, and then use a hand crossbow. And they thought about it and said, you know what? That goblin's Cad Bane, isn't it? And I said, well, he's certainly inspired by Cad Bane. But the simple fact of the matter is that you make the character, you make the scenario your own by giving it enough believability and realism to fit in the particular story or the particular game that you're trying to run at that moment. And as long as you're not going for full publication, or hell, even some games that have run into full publication have done this, it doesn't matter if you get awful close to the original, as long as it's not as long as you don't just switch 2 letters in the name or whatever, as long as you don't literally have a wizard called Gandalf running around, as long as you've got some sort of change to it that fits it in with the setting that you're aiming at, then you should be good to go in most instances. And I honestly, if you're a DM and if you haven't realized this, but I know a lot of people watch my videos here for DM advice that have been DMing for a long time. You've probably already heard all this, already figured this out if you're one of those. But if you're relatively new to DMing, don't be too concerned about looking about people thinking that you've ripped something off, because as long as you can make it fun, as long as your players are having fun, and as long as you're having fun, then the game's doing its job. It really doesn't matter whether you're the most original individual in the world. As long as everybody's having fun, that's the main point of it. And I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to try to get more of these out. As I've mentioned many times in the past, I keep saying I'm going to try and get back to doing this either weekly or twice a month, and but I'm going to try to get more of these out, and I'm going to try and streamline the effort here. So anyway, if you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. If you'd like to support the channel, please feel free to check me out at patreon.com/rpgcrawler. Or if you have a particular topic that you'd like to see me address, go ahead and leave a comment below. Until next time, take care and goodbye.